First of all, it's very unique when it comes to medications for treating a disorder like this.
What exactly is going on from the perspective of the person who's suffering?
If you start taking these substances early on in the cycle, you might be able to end it in 15 days rather than 3 months.
Bob, where do you see us with regards to this issue?
If I wasn't optimistic, I wouldn't have been able to do this for the last 25 years.
You also talked about the stigma within the neurology community working with headaches.
About 70% of people with cluster headaches suffer from what is called complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
That point and everything that you said today has not only opened my mind, but it's opened my heart. Welcome back to the Webdelics podcast. We have with us in the house today, Bob Wold. Bob, welcome to the Webdelics world.
Hello, Scott. Welcome to be here, and happy to have this talk.
I am too. Today, we're going to talk about cluster headaches and, of all things, LSD might be able to change some people's lives. I would never have imagined that the words cluster headaches and LSD would have come out of my mouth together until I met you and my eyes were opened. And I think a lot of eyes are about to be opened in the next hour as you share everything that you have to. But before we go any further, Bob, exactly what is a cluster headache? That's one of those words you hear thrown about every now and then, but I didn't realize until we spoke previously that I really didn't understand what a cluster headache is. Can you explain a little bit?
Sure. It's a little bit difficult for people to understand because the first thing they hear is headaches, and headaches are usually just kind of all lumped together. But there's really over 160 different headache disorders, and cluster headaches are one of them. It's a little bit like a migraine. It has some features of that in that it's on one side of the head only. It can switch from time to time, but it's always only on one side of the head, and usually centered in the temple area and then expands out from that. The pain can go down into the lower jaw, which confuses some people during diagnosis, thinking that it might be actually starting in the jaw and the teeth and working its way up, but that's not the direction it goes. But over 40% of people end up having teeth extracted before they find out that they actually have cluster headaches, and nothing wrong with their teeth. And I've met some people that have had all of their teeth removed. So with clusters, it's fairly rare in that there's only about 350,000 people in the U.S. that suffer from cluster headaches, versus migraine, which is probably close to 40 million people that have migraine off and on. The pain of the cluster headache is where they got the name cluster from, because the pain and the attacks come in clusters. 85% of the people have what's called episodic clusters, and they'll get a cluster cycle once or twice a year that lasts anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months long. It comes on very quickly, and it lasts the specific amount of time that that person's cycles last. Then will go away rather quickly and then be gone for a few months or even up to a year before they get another cycle just like it the following year. I've had 2 3-month long cycles twice a year for the last 45 years. So that's 6 months out of the year I've had these cluster headaches. The attacks themselves last usually around an hour, but they can range anywhere from 45 minutes to 3 hours long, versus a migraine that can last three days long. And it's a much more sharp pain that's centered in the temple area. And people describe it kind of as like a hot poker being pressed in their temple behind their eye and trying to push the eyeball out. It's a very, very severe pressure and a very sharp pain. that can last, an hour and a half, and within a couple of minutes it stops completely, and you're back to a completely pain-free state and just have to recover from that period of time. And then people usually have anywhere from 3 to 8 of these episodes every day. So if they have them, an hour a piece each time, they'll have 3 hours worth or 8 hours worth every day. And they're very cyclical, tied to the body clock and the brain. Or if you have one at 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, you're going to have one at 2 o'clock every afternoon until your cycle ends, within minutes. And they're all basically going to last exactly as long as the last one lasted. And whatever it is that you happen to have, whatever you have to try to treat it, to try to end it quicker. In some cases you can do that, in other cases you can't. So in general, those are the main features of a cluster headache attack. Very painful, very specific to the area and behind the eye and the pressure, and very specific about when they start and when they end every year, and how many attacks you're going to get every day.
It almost goes without saying, but I have to ask it anyway. If you have this syndrome, I cannot imagine how you could function within a job. Maybe if you work for yourself, or if you have a profession like where you're a writer and you totally set your own schedule. But if you're just a regular Joe or Jane Doe who has a job or wants to have a job, how do people even begin to function in the workplace, let alone in school, even if you have this sort of syndrome going on? I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It usually takes us a while to find some sort of a job or a career that we can actually hang on to. It's tough hanging on to a job, depending on when you start. Lots of people are entering college or halfway through college, and they develop this, and they have to drop out of school. And there are younger people that do get them, and when that happens when they're in school, it can be really discouraging and difficult to be properly diagnosed, because if they start going into see the nurse every day at 1 o'clock with this terrible headache, the nurses and the teachers and the administrators think, well, Bob just wants to miss out history class, because every day history class starts at 1 o'clock, and you just have to get through it and go back to history class or gym class or whatever it might be. That sometimes physical exertion will trigger them. And so, if you've got phys ed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon every day, it's very likely that you'll be triggering a cluster headache attack. And people are just going to think that you don't want to go to a physical education class anymore. So I just finish. Yeah, I mean, I've been personally really self-employed for since my mid-20s because of cluster headaches. It would have been really impossible to keep any kind of a career in the things that I was hoping to build a career in.
We're going to talk a little bit more about your own journey with these headaches in a moment. But before we do that, I'm curious, is this something that runs in families? I assume it's genetic, or is it not? What do we know about what causes these? What might predispose someone to this?
One of the reasons why I started my organization was because there's always been very little research on cluster headaches specifically. There have been some signals of that there is possibly a genetic factor. Usually somewhere between 10 and 15% of people do report that someone in their family, their father or their grandfather or great-grandfather, may have also had cluster headaches. In some of those cases, if it was your grandfather, it was even more difficult to get them diagnosed. So your grandfather may have lived 40 years without ever being properly diagnosed as having cluster headaches. which was the case with my grandfather. Um, he was never diagnosed with cluster headaches, but he had all the nerves on the one side of his face severed to kill all the nerves in his face, um, and that helped a lot because his entire face was numb. Um, but and that kind of surgery was fairly common with clusters for a long time. But the problem there was sometimes the cluster headaches will change sides. So if you have all the nerves cut on the left side of your face, the next year the clusters may appear on the other side of your head. And they can't cut all the nerves in your face because then basically your face will just slide off of your skull. And, and you have no control over any muscles once those nerves are all severed. So um, that surgery kind of fell out of favor after a lot of people were, going in requesting the other side to be severed also.
Wow. And is there any association of having cluster headaches with other morbidities? Does it impact your lifespan? I mean, quality of life. I just can't even begin to imagine the mental health implications of this too. I mean, it's hard to imagine that people that have these aren't at a minimum suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, depression.
Yeah, yeah. Um, there are certainly a lot of mental health issues that are generated by this condition, and quality of life is really difficult. As far as lifespan goes, the worst thing we have going for us that would be lowering our usual lifespan is the suicide rate is about 20%, or 20 times the national average. Um, Otherwise, you can live a long life with these things if you can make it. The oldest person I ever talked to about this was I got a call from I don't know, she was in her late 70s. A woman in Denmark called me wanting to get information on treating cluster headaches. So I started talking to her, and I thought it was herself that I was talking about, but she was looking for information for her mother, who was 99 years old in a nursing home in Denmark and had been going through cluster headaches since her late 20s, early 30s, and now she's 99 years old in a nursing home and still having cluster headaches and with really nothing to treat them. So um, if we find a way to do it, we certainly can live a long life, but the suicide rate is pretty high for this condition.
I cannot even begin to imagine. A lot doesn't leave me speechless, but this does. Bob, talk to us a little bit about your own journey with these headaches.
Okay. I have a fairly typical story with them. I was in my early 20s and mid 20s when I developed these. I had um, got married 5 or 6 years before that, very young. I had a couple of kids. My oldest was my 6-year-old son. And we were out in the backyard one Sunday afternoon playing football. And I started getting head pain, which I had really never experienced before. I probably hadn't taken aspirin for a headache in more than 2 or 3 times in my life, and sat down and had this terrible pain, knocked me to my knees, had no idea what was going on, trying to decide if I should call 911. And within about an hour, it completely went away. It was gone. And it was like, what was that? And had no idea. So I didn't call 911, but then it happened again the next day, the same time, and kept on happening. So then I went into my doctor, and that started a 4-year period where I was misdiagnosed for 4 years. And nobody had ever mentioned the word cluster headache to me. Once again, they started in my mid 20s, and I still have them now with a cycle or two to try to start every year. First 20 years I had them, I had tried 70 different prescription medications that provided no relief at all until I found what I currently use and ended up forming this organization called Cluster Busters, which has really been advocating for the patients and working on legislation as well as all the healthcare issues and pushing for more research for people with cluster headaches. So that's been the last 25 years doing that.
So let's talk about what you're using now to help with them. That's LSD, correct?
Well, that's one of the things that I'm using is LSD. And that was the first thing that came to our community, the first thing that discussed these types of treatments. Back in the late 90s, in the early days of the internet, we had formed a online message board and website for patients to just chat and discuss different things that we were using, little tricks that we had found to try to keep on surviving this disorder, because none of us were getting much help at all going to see doctors. But those that were getting some help through medications were able to share that. We were all being seen by, most of the time, doctors that had no idea how to treat cluster headaches or how to treat a cluster headache patient. So we were a small group, but kind of worldwide at that time in the early days. Message boards back then didn't look anything at all like they look today. But somebody came to the message board and just asked a question about whether or not anybody had ever heard anything about LSD possibly helping to treat cluster headaches. And being a smaller group at that time, a couple of people were not real happy with this guy even asking the question, thinking that he was just joining the group to possibly, I don't know, sell drugs or look for drugs or something. But a few of us were interested in the topic because we had learned a little bit about the different types of treatments that we were using that some people were getting some success with. And we found out that LSD on a molecular structure level was very similar to a lot of the medications that were being used for cluster and migraine and other headache disorders. And then we found out that when Dr. Hoffman actually invented LSD, that was one of the things that he was working on were headache treatments for Sandoz company, which was a very, very large pharmaceutical company. And he was working with ergotamines, which are sort of a molecule that grows in fungus and is used for a lot of different things, bleeding disorders and things. LSD was one of the things that he had developed in his lab and put up onto a shelf for years. So we all started doing a little bit more research, and all of us, everybody with clusters, is always searching for some kind of relief. And so it was a very interesting topic for a few of us in particular, and doing as much research as we could. And and at that point, and probably still pretty much the case today, not very many people have access to LSD, especially if you're not in the psychedelic world. If you're a school teacher, 35 or 40 years old, you've never gone out to buy LSD. Maybe some may, but the majority of people in our community, many of them middle-aged, had never even tried LSD before, and so did not know how to get access to it. So we found out that magic mushrooms contain psilocybin, which is very similar to LSD and was sort of a natural version of LSD. And we were able to not only get our hands on that for some people, but we were able to grow our own. And so we really did a lot of self-experimentation with magic mushrooms, much more so than LSD, just because of access issues. But we ended up publishing a paper out of Harvard in 2006 that showed how successful we were being with psilocybin and LSD. And it seemed that LSD, and it always has seemed like LSD, it actually works a little bit better than psilocybin for treating our cluster headache cycles. Nobody knows why, but it may be connected to the fact that the time that it's active in your body is like twice as long as mushrooms are. You know, you're looking at 12 hours rather than 6 hours, and that may be why it is a little bit better than mushrooms are. But so we've done a lot of self-experimentation and data collection for a long time, and I've produced a lot of research. A lot of it we've had to fund ourselves because it's not a thing that pharmaceutical companies can even get their money back after doing a trial, because it's not something that they could sell to 10 million people, and then the people that they are selling it to, they may only need to sell it 2 or 3 pills a year, and not you don't take an LSD tab every day to treat this. You take 2 or 3 tabs over 10 days or 15 days and completely end the cycle. You don't keep on taking them to treat the headaches. It actually treats the cycle itself and ends it.
So when you say that it treats it, what exactly happens? And to clarify what I mean, most people associate a journey using LSD or psilocybin with ingesting the substance, a brief period of it sort of integrating itself into your body, and then going on a journey that, as we discussed earlier in passing, lasts a certain amount of time. Then that journey ends. Now, when you are ingesting one of these substances as someone with a cluster headache, what happens exactly from the perspective of the person who's experiencing the headache? Like, when they begin their hallucinogenic journey, does the pain go away? Does it stay away after they come out of it? Like, what exactly is going on from the perspective of the person who's suffering?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's very unique when it comes to medications for treating a disorder like this. In that, yes, it doesn't just treat that one attack. When I'm talking about LSD and psilocybin, it treats this cycle that I was talking about that may last 3 months. You know, if you start taking these substances early on in the cycle, you might be able to end it in 15 days rather than 3 months. If you take a dose before your cycle would normally start, like if your cycle is going to start in September, if you take a dose in August and then be ready for another dose in case you need it, you may completely miss that cycle in September. So, and I've missed a lot of cycles by doing that. We call that maintenance dosing in between what our normal cycles would be. So it lasts much, much longer than while the medicine is in our systems. The other point with that, as far as the dose goes, is they're really relatively low doses that people take, where most people, explain their trip level is like a 2-beer buzz. Colors get a little bit brighter. Everybody that has used psychedelics can relate to this, where colors get brighter and stereo effect on music expands, it spreads out. If you look at flat surfaces, it can show a little waviness. If you look at your arm, and the hair on your arm might look like it's blowing in the wind, something like that. And that's usually as much as people need to take to treat their headache disorders. They don't need to take a recreational dose, which everybody's really happy about because you wouldn't want to have to trip, that often. Um, but what we also found at that low dose, which is really not something that's talked about, is um, you mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder earlier. That what we have found, and we haven't been able to convince a lot of people to do research on this yet, but the research that we have and data shows that about 70% of people with cluster headaches suffer from what is called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's something that is being more talked about now and is finally becoming a sort of a new term, in that your traumatic stress was not something that happened 15 years ago. It's something that happened an hour ago and that is going to happen again 2 hours later, to try to deal with that stress of not only getting over that amount of pain for that length of time, but then while you're recovering, you know that you're going to go through it again in 2 hours or 3 hours, or every day for the next 3 months. So you're not just trying to recover from the previous trauma, but you know that the trauma is going to happen exactly the same way again in a short period of time. And people that are using psychedelics to treat their cluster headaches, they do it without a therapist in the room. They do it usually with their caregiver. It might be their husband or their wife or their mother or their brother or their best friend. And they'll sit there for that 4 to 6 hours or 12 hours and just have some conversations with their caregiver and come out the other side of it, really with that post-traumatic stress disorder also healing and feeling much better about themselves, much better about their life, think that they have something that that they can actually use, that's going to help them, that's going to work for them, after years and years of medications that did not work. For them to have some kind of control over their health is a huge factor. So yeah, post-traumatic stress disorder scores are below the diagnostic range for post-traumatic stress for people with clusters that use psychedelics. So even at those low doses, all those mental health issues are really improved with these occasional doses of psilocybin or LSD.
Bob, you mentioned the extraordinarily high suicide rate within the cluster headache community. Putting myself in the shoes of someone who would experience the disorder, the horrors that you described, it's impossible not to imagine why and how people would get into that state. And it pains my heart to imagine that there are people suffering like that. But it also deeply moves me that there is a treatment that's really minimal that could alleviate that. I mean, we're not talking about just ending suffering here. We are literally talking about game-changing, life-saving applications of substances that have been completely marginalized. Did you all have any issues getting the studies that you conducted published by an institution like Harvard, by any institution? Was there resistance to even hearing what you had to say, or were the medical establishment people that you're speaking to like, oh, tell us more, please?
Oh, talk about resistance. Yeah, resistance has been my life for the last 25 years. Getting people to even listen to the story. When I first started writing doctors about this, they wouldn't even return my emails if it had the word psilocybin or LSD in it, because they were afraid with this new technology called email that their name was going to be searched out and found that they were talking to somebody about illegal Schedule 1 substances. So I couldn't even get doctors or researchers to talk to me. So finding people that would was a real challenge. And then finding people that might want to fund that research is still an enormous challenge. Um, but yeah, one day I had to walk into the Harvard University boardroom and talk to the administrators in the psychiatry department and convince them to do psychedelic research of any kind at all since they fired Timothy Leary. And I was able to get them to sign off on that and do that research. And yeah, we got that published in 2006. Um, but they weren't having to give LSD to anyone in their clinic. That would have been the next step at Harvard, but we never got to that point at Harvard. We eventually got to it at Yale 17 years later, where they were actually giving psilocybin to cluster headache patients. But yeah, that was a 17-year struggle to get them to actually fund a study and find the researchers that would do a study 17 years after, the first proof was published in 2006. So it's been very frustrating, yes, knowing that there's something out there that could save so many lives and change lives, and discovering all the gatekeepers between a good idea and getting it to people.
My own journey on this podcast as someone who was not native to the psychedelic space when I started it, reminds what you said reminds me of where I was coming from. I had grown up with the stigma associated with these substances. They were bad. They did all sorts of damaging things. There was a mental model that propaganda basically around them had created in my mind, so that, like those people who were on those old message boards who might have initially just reacted negatively to it, I would have been like, well, we can't just have all of society break down because some people have decided that these drugs that are illegal for a doggone good reason might be able to help them. There's got to be another way that's better than that. Yet by stepping into this and exploring it and listening to stories, my own mental models have changed. I can't help but react to the fact that even with evidence and a publication in a credible journal like the Harvard one would still lead to 17 more years of resistance, 17 more years of suffering and suicides. Do you think this tide is beginning to change at all? Or do you think we're more or less in the same place? Where do you see us at? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, it's certainly very, very frustrating. We've always had um, some things that we had to overcome. Um, one being the stigma around not only psychedelic drugs, as you know, everybody that's 50 years old, saw 40 years of TV ads about this is your brain on drugs and told how dangerous drugs are. But then, you find out that psychedelics weren't made Schedule One because they were dangerous. They were used for decades in research studies and having great results, treating things like alcoholism and depression and a lot of that. And it was all stopped back in the 70s. And it wasn't because they were dangerous. It was because um, there were a lot of protesters walking the streets trying to end a war, and to bolster the war effort, they wanted a way of um, arresting a bunch of people that were calling for peace. So we had that one stigma about the dangerous drugs to overcome, and even convincing people in my community that you should really try LSD. And the first thing that they think of is, even if they had used LSD previously, like when they were in college, their thought goes through the mind of, I don't think I could survive having a cluster headache attack while I'm on a trip. I couldn't survive that. Um, but the best thing about this is that you don't take it when you're in a trip, and while you're on it, you won't get one. Even if you were supposed to get one, you won't get an attack. So it's very rare that anybody has any head pain at all while they're on psychedelics when they're treating a headache disorder. The other stigma is headache stigma overall. I mean, headaches in general carry a huge stigma in this country, where when people say that they have a headache, they're basically just told, stop complaining, take 2 aspirin and go to work like you're supposed to. Quit trying to get out of work, get off the couch, go to work, take 2 aspirin. It works for me. So people, have had to go to work in severe head pain, otherwise they're going to lose their job. And they'll find them crying in the bathroom, at lunchtime or whatever. But so fighting that stigma for research in headache disorders has been huge in the medical system and healthcare system that we use here in the States. We just had a little run in the last decade of about maybe 5 years where there was some large pharma companies putting big money into some research for treating migraine and clusters. Minimally, migraine mostly, but we did convince one company to do a large study for clusters. But that whole molecule now has been kind of researched and everybody's moving on. And, until they find another molecule that they think they can make their money back for treating headache disorders, it's probably going to be a while. But even in neurology, there's a stigma there where doctors or people graduate and decide what their specialty is going to be. And, if any of them say that I'm going to specialize in headache disorders, a lot of them are made fun of by their fellow neurologists going, why would you want to study something like that? Why don't you study something interesting like Parkinson's or, all of the other neurological disorders that there are? With all the research going on in this, why would you want to treat something that there really isn't anything out there that can actually treat them? Don't you want to make people feel better? And don't you want to work with people that you can help? Because there's so little out there for headaches, a lot of neurologists are looked down upon if they specialize in headache. And so we've actually been able to work with and find some incredibly smart, dedicated neurologists and headache specialists. Those numbers are increasing, but I think there's only 700 or 800 qualified headache specialists in the country that are really certified as specialists in headache disorders. Some states may only have one or two, and that's a long road to go because even those few neurologists in a state are only going to see a couple of headache or cluster headache patients. And they come in, they may treat them for a month or two or a cycle or two, and then they leave. And they think that they've helped them or cured them or got them on a medication that would work, and they're able to go back to life, but they just leave them because they weren't getting any help. So, neurologists can go decades with only treating a couple of patients and learning it all about the cluster headache condition and the cluster headache patient and what they really need. So yeah, there's a lot of lonely roads we've been traveling, and for a lot of different reasons.
And yet I can't help but wonder, as I'm hearing all of this, if the movement, at least around decriminalization, while perhaps not perfect, at least opens up a pathway for people to be able to deal with this. One of the things, look, I worked in government for nearly 20 years, Bob, and thinking about where I was when I had those sorts of jobs, even if I had a cluster headache and knew that a substance like psilocybin or LSD could help me, I still might have been too terrified to take it for fear that I would be tested for my job or asked about it on a job application. I, because I believe in integrity, would answer honestly, or would be forced to have the truth exposed potentially if I was tested in a certain time frame of when I might have had, taken a psilocybin or LSD dosage, and then could lose my job because these substances are Schedule 1, they're illegal, and you can get in trouble. If there's not enough of a market out there for them, for big pharmacy to want to get involved and be able to bring these to the masses, at least I would think decriminalization would allow people, in the case of psilocybin, to grow their own things and be able to get some sort of relief. Is that part of where your movement is at, or is your movement in a different place? What is the focus of the movement now with regards to helping people get some relief here?
Yeah, that is something that we're very involved in right now. I mean, that's probably um, the one area that if we can move forward where we're probably going to be able to get some kind of relief on a state level. There are a lot of states now that are starting to write some legislation for everything from decriminalization down to just some research funding with psychedelics. They're pretty much decriminalized in Colorado now, where you can actually share psychedelics. You can share psilocybin with friends. You can't sell it to them, but you can share it. The program in Portland, Oregon, or in Oregon, where they've rolled out some places where people can go in for legal treatments for mental health disorders. But that's not the kind of treatment that cluster headache or headache patients need. I mean, they don't need a therapist. They don't need to wait 6 weeks on a waiting list to get in to see somebody. They don't need to go through, a month of integration training and then a 1 or 2 doses, large doses with 2 therapists in the room, and then 2 more months of integration. It's like, I don't need integration. I need to go back to work because it worked. I don't need 2 months of integration. So we're involved in a lot of legislative work. Even that is difficult. There are competing voices for what can go into the legislation. A lot of states don't want to get accepted too broadly, so they want to treat a special list of disorders only, and pain is not a disorder that a lot of states want to start with having in their legislation, just because the stigma around pain. And a lot of the research that's going on now is being funded for mental health disorders, so there's more research that legislators can rely on to look for things for decriminalization. But yeah, I mean, we have a very large community that grows it themselves. They can, for $100 investment, they can have a year's worth of medicine in their own home. They don't even have to travel to Walgreens. They can grow it in their own bedroom. And they can be very sure of exactly what it is that they have. They can weigh out exactly how much they need to take. They can grow it and store it and have it when they need it. Not need to go into any doctor or pharmacy to get the treatment. But yeah, many people can't use them because of the issue that you talked about being tested and afraid of losing their job. I've talked to an awful lot of people that, number one, have waited 10 or 15 years or whatever to finally retire from their job so that they could try it, whether it was a truck driver that would be randomly tested for a CDL license and afraid to lose his job, to a district court judge that would wait to be retired because if he got caught or got the word out that he was using psychedelics, he would certainly lose his job. Police officers, first responders. So I end up getting contacted by a lot of people in those situations looking for help, and how they might be able to try them. And the one thing, most companies that drug test don't test for LSD and psilocybin. Those have to be specifically tested for. They're pretty expensive. And most of those tests are usually only looking to catch the usual suspects that companies know about. Cocaine, heroin, meth, whatever it is that they're worried about. But if they're doing company-wide tests, they want to keep that list as short as possible because it's expensive. And, plus they would rather not have to lose employees. So, but yeah, large segment of the population, especially with cluster headaches, once they finally found a job that they could work around, they could work into their schedule and keep, and find enough help to be able to hang on to that job. They don't want anything that's going to possibly disrupt their employment. It might have taken them 10 years to finally find a job they could do and provide, a roof over their family's head. And the thought of losing that job and, being lucky enough for their boss not to drug test for psilocybin, it's quite a bridge to have to try to travel.
Bob, where do you see us with regards to this issue in 5 to 10 years? Are you optimistic, or is there no hope?
No, I'm optimistic. If I wasn't optimistic, I wouldn't have been able to do this for the last 25 years. We have made some headway, getting the education out there. I don't know on a federal level. I don't know if it'll be another 30 years before they reschedule psychedelics. I mean, there's enough evidence now that they shouldn't be scheduled, or Schedule 3 or Schedule 2. Marijuana is still scheduled federally. So we're making a lot of headway on a state level. And if more and more states decriminalize it and do a lot more research and start being able to provide treatments for their first responders, for the VA has always been really interested. We've had a lot of friends at the VA trying to help veterans that have absolutely nothing to rely on that can treat their post-traumatic stress disorder, and their suicide rates are so high. And so there are people at the VA that are really interested in finding this because they're getting so many reports that veterans are being helped that have gone decades without anything helping. So on that level, there's going to be pressure from that level on a federal level, but also a state level for states that want to take care of their first responders and veterans and get these things rescheduled and made available for people. Access is the big thing that we've known it's worked for 25 years for cluster headaches and also for migraine. So access has always been our number one issue, and trying to increase that. There's going to have to be some big changes that take place so that there is equal access for everybody at an affordable amount and being able to get it when they need it. This stuff is so cheap, you shouldn't even need insurance. You just should be able to grow your own if you want to. or go pick up something. But and has been a lot more money going into psychedelic research over the last decade or 6 or 8 years, and so we need more of that research money funding coming in. Um, once there's large dollars on the table for people um, to invest and to make, um, it's going to get a lot more interest in moving it forward and making more access. People aren't going to want to put $50 million into a research study and not be able to sell it to somebody. Um, so um, the fact that they're scheduled and limited access the way it is now, I mean, that's really what's holding back hundreds of millions of dollars of research funding that people would like to put into it if they think that they can at least get their money back.
Bob, this has been a truly astonishing conversation. There's a lot that I will remember about it. On perhaps the deepest level of all, it has me thinking about stigma, not just around psychedelics and drugs. As you mentioned, I was one of those kids that grew up, this is your drug on brains, right? And for those who don't know what we're talking about, there was an ad that was on television that had a skillet and fried eggs, right? You're implying that drugs, including psychedelics, would scramble your brains. It was scary. It made an impression, and it led to a stigma that I didn't question. You also talked about the stigma within the neurology community working with headaches. When we trivialize or create mental models, it often can become so cemented that we become blind to the real human implications and the realities that other people live in that might be blocked from us being able to think through, feel, and act upon real human suffering. And that is the thing that, as I look inside myself, I'll remember most about this conversation, not to mention having a totally different understanding of what cluster headaches are and why the psychedelic renaissance is so important to a community that's suffering right now. Bob, if there's something that you'd like to reiterate that you said earlier, or something that you didn't get to say that you want to, please share.
Yeah, well, I think I hit on most of the high points, but the big thing is um, for people to kind of look past that stigma. If your brother or wife or mother are complaining about a headache and they had to miss Johnny's birthday party, um, believe me, they're probably really suffering. There are a lot of different headache disorders, and people go decades trying to explain what their suffering is to family members and friends, and the little bit of education that they have about it, don't understand it, and in a lot of cases just don't believe it and think that people are exaggerating their pain. Um, they aren't exaggerating their pain. They're trying to explain how much suffering is really going on. And that's not just with headache disorders. That's with a lot of disorders that people suffer with and really have to hide from friends and family and coworkers and the society that they're trying to survive in, keeping jobs and keeping relationships. So it's not just cluster headaches where people are suffering kind of in silence. So just have a little bit of empathy towards people that are trying to communicate that suffering to you, and give them a little bit of grace. And I don't know. That's the last point I'll kind of leave out there. So.
That point and everything that you said today has not only opened my mind, but it's opened my heart. And I have no doubt that it will open other minds and hearts as well. That's what this conversation's all about. Bob, where can people find out more about you? How can they reach out and connect?
Yeah. Well, you can find us on our website, which is clusterbusters.org, O-R-G.com. We're a nonprofit organization. And the lucky ones that are listening here, you can write me directly at bob@clusterbusters.org, and you'll end up in my mailbox. And I'm happy to help. That's what I do, is help people one-on-one, one at a time. I got another 300,000 people in the U.S. to help one at a time, so I got a busy schedule, but I'm happy to help one at a time. That's what I do. So, yeah.
Get to work, my brother.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so very much. For those of you who enjoyed this episode, be sure to press the thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube, or leave us a 5-star review if you are listening on Apple or Spotify or another audio platform. Be sure to subscribe as well. In addition, if you're watching on YouTube, don't hesitate to leave a comment beneath the captions. We want to hear what you have to say. In addition, once you have done all of that, we'd love it if you shared this episode with anyone who you think that it might impact, especially anyone you know who might be suffering from a headache disorder, or who may know someone who is suffering from a headache disorder. After you finished all of that, connect with us on our social media sites, and then go to our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. Sign up for our newsletter. The information on it is incredible. And then make sure, above all else, that you come back next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.